A medieval castle, towering majestically over its surroundings, was not only a symbol of power and might, but also the last line of defense in turbulent times. But what happened when an enemy army approached? Today we will delve into the harsh world of sieges to learn how castle dwellers resisted not only enemy troops, but also the merciless forces of nature and hunger, turning everyday skills into a true art of survival. Watch the video to the end to find out exactly how people survived during a castle siege and what they had to do to survive. Winter during the siege was not just a test of endurance, but a real third party in the conflict, ruthless and unpredictable. For the besieging army, which had set up camp in the open field, it became a deadly enemy. But for the resourceful defenders of the castle, protected by thick stone walls, the severe frost could become an unexpected and powerful ally. Imagine the situation of the enemy army. Soldiers huddle in tents blown by the wind, trying to warm themselves by smoldering fires. The ground is so frozen that it is almost impossible to dig proper trenches or tunnels. Each gust of icy wind carries away their fighting spirit, and disease and frostbite begin to mow down the ranks of soldiers faster than arrows from the walls. Morale falls with each passing day, and the siege turns into a slow agony. The inhabitants of the castle, watching this from the walls, understood perfectly well that the cold was their main weapon, and one of the most unusual and brutally effective strategies was the active use of this weapon, the creation of an icy barrier around the castle walls. The idea was simple but ingenious: to turn the approaches to their fortress into an impregnable ice mountain, a deadly trap created by nature itself under their careful guidance. This tactic was especially effective for castles built on hills or surrounded by steep earthen embankments, glacis. The process required serious preparation and coordinated work. Special teams of defenders were engaged in collecting and melting snow and ice. In large cauldrons over bonfires, they prepared the main component of this defensive line: water. It was hard work, but the result was worth all the effort. Under cover of night, when the frost was at its strongest, the main phase of the operation began. The defenders, lined up on the walls, began to methodically pour water from the battlements and from special wooden gutters. They did not just splash it down, the water was poured carefully, layer by layer. The thin layer of water instantly froze in the icy wind, forming a smooth crust. Then they poured the next layer on top of it, and so on. After several nights of such work, the foot of the wall and all the slopes leading to it turned into a solid, polished skating rink. This man-made glacier, sparkling in the rays of the winter sun, may have looked beautiful, but for the attackers it was a real nightmare. Attempting an assault in such conditions was tantamount to suicide. The heavy siege towers that had to be rolled up to the wall became useless. Their wheels could not find traction on the ice, slipped, and the entire cumbersome structure either got stuck halfway or tilted dangerously, risking collapse and burying the entire crew under it. Scaffolding ladders, the main weapon of the infantry, became a deadly trap. It was impossible to set them up securely on slippery, sloping ice. The base of the ladder slid to the side as soon as the first soldier stepped on the crossbar, dragging everyone on it down with him. Soldiers in heavy armor rolled down, breaking their bones and becoming easy targets for archers and crossbowmen on the walls. Even simply approaching the wall on foot was a nearly impossible task. The warriors lost their balance, fell, and their battle formation fell apart. Instead of a formidable attacking force, only scattered, exhausted, and disoriented soldiers reached the walls, whom the defenders could destroy one by one without much effort. The psychological effect was enormous. The ice inspired more terror than swords and arrows. This tactic turned passive defense into active defense, using the climate itself as a weapon of mass destruction. It required water supplies, but in winter, this resource was usually abundant in the form of snow. Ultimately, the ice wall was the perfect defensive tool. Cheap, renewable, and incredibly demoralizing for the enemy. We would be very interested to hear your opinion. What other natural phenomena besides frost do you think the besieged could have used to their advantage? Please share your thoughts in the comments. One of the most serious, relentless, and inevitable threats during any siege was not the rumbling, battering ram or the stones of the catapults, but an invisible, silent enemy that penetrated the thickest walls and the strongest gates: hunger. It was a quiet and incredibly patient killer that sucked the life out of the defenders day after day, turning a once mighty and proud fortress into a cold stone prison for its own inhabitants. Sooner or later, but inevitably, the castle's food supplies were running out, and then the harsh military confrontation was replaced by a primitive, desperate war for survival. In these conditions, the art of finding and preserving food became vital, pushing even the most sophisticated military tactics and personal bravery into the background. In the face of all-consuming hunger, the courage and skill of a warrior gave way to peasant ingenuity, resourcefulness, and the ability to eat what in peacetime would not have been considered food. The besieged were forced to use all possible sources, sometimes the most unexpected, risky, and desperate, to delay the inevitable end. In the early stages of the siege, when the castle still had relative order, strength, and fighting spirit, the defenders could organize daring, lightning-fast sorties outside the walls. These were extremely risky operations. Under cover of night or thick morning fog, a small, specially selected detachment of the bravest and most agile warriors could silently leave the fortress through a secret passage in the wall or a camouflaged gate. Their target was not enemy soldiers, but anything that could prolong the lives of their comrades and families. They made their way to the nearest fields in the hope of gathering at least a little grain, dug up vegetables from abandoned gardens, or even made suicidal attempts to steal a cow or a few sheep from the besiegers' camp. Every sack of flour or armful of carrots brought back was seen as a great victory, giving them a few more days to live. However, such forays were a deadly dangerous undertaking. The enemy was always on the alert. The besiegers' camp was surrounded by posts and patrols. Any crack of a branch, any careless sound could lead to the failure of the mission and the death of the entire detachment. With each passing day of the siege, the enemy tightened its ring, cutting down trees and bushes around the castle, depriving the defenders of any cover. Very soon, such operations became absolutely impossible. Therefore, the main focus was on what was already inside the walls. In the first days of the siege, the castle's steward, the castellan, became one of the key figures. With a heavy bunch of keys in his hands, he conducted a thorough and ruthless inventory of every single edible supply. Every sack of grain, every barrel of salted meat and dried fish, every wheel of hard cheese, and every jug of wine or ale was strictly accounted for. From that moment on, a strict ration distribution of food was introduced. Rations were cut to the absolute minimum, just enough to sustain life and the ability to hold a weapon. Portions became smaller with each passing week, and the quality of food steadily declined. When clean grain began to run out, bran, acorn flour, quinoa, and in the most desperate times, even crushed bark and wood shavings were mixed into the bread to increase its volume. Absolutely everything was used, from dried vegetables and the last grains to old, rock-hard salted meat, which had to be cooked for hours to make it even slightly edible. Even moldy cheese rinds were cut off and thrown into the communal pot. Every bite eaten was counted, every crumb spilled was a tragedy. At the same time, attempts were made to find at least some renewable sources of food inside the castle. The small vegetable gardens that far-sighted owners had laid out in the courtyard became invaluable. Every cabbage leaf, every onion, and every bunch of greens was a treasure. Dovecotes, which in peacetime supplied meat to the Lord's table, provided a small but important amount of fresh meat. If the castle had a large enough well, an internal pond, or a stream, it was fished for eels, tench, and other fish until the last fish was caught. Every free patch of land, every crack in the walls where grass could grow, was carefully searched for edible roots, leaves, and berries. People remembered everything their ancestors had taught them about surviving in the forest. But what happened when even these last, meager sources dried up? When the last handful of grain was boiled into thin soup, the last thatched roof was searched and threshed for seeds, and only feathers and wind remained in the empty dovecote, the siege reached its final, most terrible and inhuman phase. The defenders, reduced to shadows of their former selves, exhausted and weakened, faced a final choice: to die of starvation with weapons in their hands, to surrender to the mercy of the enemy, which most often meant slavery or death, or to cross the final line beyond which the unthinkable begins, that which is not spoken of aloud.
Hold the line!
What unusual sources of food do you think the besieged could have used to survive? What became food when there was no food left? Watch the video to the end to find out the answer to this question. While most castles relied solely on the thickness of their walls and the supplies in their storerooms, some particularly forward-thinking fortresses had unique and ingenious solutions. They allowed food to be grown literally within the stone perimeter, turning the fortress into something more than just a military facility. This was not just an element of everyday life or a hobby, but a deeply thought-out strategic advantage that could determine the outcome of a long and exhausting siege. We are talking about small but carefully planned gardens and vegetable gardens. They could be located in inner courtyards, on terraces protected from the wind, on the wide tops of towers, or even in specially equipped niches in the thickness of the walls themselves. It was true survival architecture, where every patch of land exposed to sunlight was considered an invaluable resource. These inner gardens were no accident. Castle architects and engineers, understanding the critical importance of self-sufficiency, designed the space inside the fortress in advance. They deliberately left areas of open land that could be used for agriculture. The inner courtyards, surrounded by a ring of high walls, were almost the perfect place for such gardens. A unique microclimate was created here, protection from icy winds and relative warmth emanating from the stone walls, heated by the sun. In these hidden gardens, far from enemy eyes and deadly catapult projectiles, a wide variety of crops could be grown. It was a small oasis of life in the middle of a stone desert, a symbol of hope and perseverance. Here, every sprout was worth its weight in gold, and every fruit harvested was a small victory over hunger. Of course, it must be understood that the scale of such internal agriculture could not provide adequate and nutritious food for the entire garrison and the inhabitants of the castle. But their value lay elsewhere. Even a small amount of fresh greens, vegetables, or medicinal herbs was an incredibly important aid. In conditions where the main food for months was stale breadcrumbs, salted meat, and dried fish, fresh onions, crispy carrots, or a bunch of parsley were a real treat and a source of invaluable vitamins. Such an addition to the diet was of enormous medical importance. It helped to combat scurvy, a terrible disease caused by vitamin deficiency, which could weaken and destroy the garrison faster than any assault. A healthy warrior is a strong warrior, and these small gardens contributed to the castle's defensibility. In addition, the psychological impact of these gardens should not be underestimated. They supported the morale of the besieged, giving them the feeling that life, despite the blockade and constant threat, was continuing. The sight of growing greenery and the very process of caring for plants were a powerful anchor that kept people from despair. It was a reminder of normal life and that the siege would one day end. Caring for these mini gardens became a kind of daily ritual, a sacred duty that distracted from the hardships of the siege. The people who worked on these plots, Often women or elderly residents of the castle felt important and needed. Their work was no less valuable than the valor of the warriors standing on the walls. While the soldiers defended the castle from external enemies, the gardeners defended its inhabitants from internal enemies, hunger and disease. Such edible fortresses were the most striking evidence not only of engineering ingenuity, but also of the remarkable foresight of their owners. These lords understood that a real castle was not just a military machine designed for destruction. It was, above all, a self-sufficient, living community that had to be ready for any challenge and able to survive in complete isolation. And they valued the patch of fertile land within the walls no less than the height and thickness of those walls. Along with slow, exhausting hunger, there was another, much more urgent and terrible threat during a siege: a shortage of water. While a person can survive for weeks without food, without water, they face a painful death within a few days. Water was the lifeblood of a castle, and as soon as its flow dried up, the fortress was doomed. Castle wells, the main source of life-giving moisture, became the main target for the enemy. If the well was located in the outer courtyard, it could be captured at the first breach of the defenses. But even if it was safe, it could be poisoned. During a night raid, a saboteur could throw an animal carcass or poison into the well, turning the source of life into a source of disease and death. This was one of the most insidious and effective tactics of the besiegers. Realizing this, the defenders of the fortress developed entire strategies to secure their water supply, turning the castle into a complex hydraulic system. Every source, every drop counted. The main task was to protect existing wells. They were not simply left open to the sky. Additional fortifications could be erected around the most important wells, a small stone tower or log cabin. This protected it not only from saboteurs, but also from enemy arrows and incendiary shells. Armed guards from among the most loyal warriors were posted at the well around the clock. Access to water was strictly controlled because everyone's life depended on it. But what if the well was lost or its flow rate was too low for hundreds of besieged people? Then a rainwater collection system came into play. The architecture of the castle was often designed with this purpose in mind. The sloping roofs of towers and buildings, stone gutters, and downspouts were designed to collect every drop of rain and direct it to one place. That place was the cistern, a huge underground reservoir carved out of rock or lined with stone and covered with waterproof plaster. The cistern was the castle's hidden treasure, its inviolable reserve. The water in it could be stored for months, remaining clean and cool. During prolonged rain, all life in the castle came to a standstill, and everyone, from young to old, made sure that the precious moisture was not lost and that every last drop flowed into the underground storage. However, it did not always rain. In dry summers or frosty winters, this source would dry up. And for this eventuality, the most prudent builders had another truly ingenious method in store. As we have already mentioned in one of our previous videos, there were special underground wells for collecting condensation. These ice traps, as they could be called, collected moisture from the air inside the castle, from the breath of hundreds of people and from the steam from kitchen hearths. They made it possible to obtain the purest distilled water even when the sky was cloudless, demonstrating the incredible ingenuity of medieval engineers. Despite all these tricks, water remained the most valuable resource. When supplies were running low, the strictest rationing was introduced. First, water was banned from being used for washing and laundry. Then rations for horses and livestock were cut. Finally, drinking water itself began to be issued in tiny portions, barely enough to moisten parched lips. Thirst became physical torture, driving people mad and robbing them of their will to resist. And so the defenders were faced with a terrible choice that defined the very essence of human suffering. What could be worse during a siege? Slowly approaching hunger that saps your strength, or all-consuming thirst that clouds your mind? What do you think could be worse during a siege? Hunger or thirst? Watch the video to the end to find out the answer to this question. Even in the most desperate conditions of the siege, When every resource was worth its weight in gold and the future was uncertain, the fire continued to burn in the heart of the castle. The hearth in the great hall or kitchen was not just a utilitarian source of heat for cooking meager meals. It became something much more, the last bastion of normal life, a symbol of hope and indomitable spirit in a world ruled by chaos, fear, and destruction. The defenders of the castle, from the lord to the last soldier, instinctively understood its enormous importance. Therefore, they tried to keep the fire burning until the very end, using fuel sparingly and carefully. Supplies of wood, peat, and coal were as important as supplies of food and water. Their distribution was monitored as strictly as the distribution of bread. Each log was a strategic resource, prolonging not only the physical, but also the moral resistance of the fortress. The hearth was a natural center of attraction for all the exhausted inhabitants of the castle. After a long and cold watch on the wall, after repelling another attack, the warriors descended into the hall to stretch their numb hands toward the living warmth. Families gathered around the fire to warm themselves, share the latest news, comfort their children, and support each other with quiet words. In these precious moments, watching the flames dance, people could briefly forget their ever-present fear, constant hunger, and piercing cold. The warmth of the hearth became a kind of psychological anchor that kept them from falling into the abyss of despair. It was a living reminder of peaceful life, of home, of safety, and it gave incredible strength to endure all the hardships of the siege. It was the only place where one could feel relatively safe, even if enemy trebuchets roared and arrows whistled outside the castle walls. The circle of light and warmth created by the fire outlined the boundaries of a small, unconquered world, living by its own rules in the midst of war. Even the most meager soup cooked over this fire seemed tastier and more satisfying. In an atmosphere of warmth and camaraderie, simple food took on a special meaning. A communal dinner by the hearth was not just a meal to sustain strength, but an important daily ritual. It strengthened morale and united people into a single whole, into one family, united by a common misfortune and a common hope. It was a time when people could talk, exchange opinions, listen to orders for the next day, and simply feel part of a community that continues to fight. This sense of camaraderie, born at the common fire, was more powerful than any fortress walls. In addition to its spiritual role, fire also played a vital practical role in maintaining cleanliness and health. Hot water was an absolute necessity. It was needed for washing dishes, clothes, and bandages for the wounded. In the crowded and unsanitary conditions inevitable during a siege, personal hygiene became the primary means of preventing epidemics. Any outbreak of dysentery or typhus could destroy a garrison more quickly and effectively than any enemy army. Therefore, the ability to boil water to make it safe to drink or use for washing was a matter of survival. Fire was a barrier to disease. Thus, the hearth in a besieged medieval castle was something immeasurably greater than just a fire. It was a symbol of life, hope, and unyielding resistance. It was the heart of the castle, which continued to beat stubbornly despite all the difficulties. And as long as it beat, the fortress was alive. In addition to the obvious physical deprivations, such as hunger, thirst, and cold, the siege exerted tremendous, crushing psychological pressure on those under siege. It was an invisible but constant attack on the very spirit of man. Long months of complete isolation from the outside world. Oppressive silence interrupted only by the terrifying sounds of enemy preparations, and the constant, clinging fear of the next assault could break even the most steadfast and hardened warriors. The people in the castle understood this threat perfectly well. They knew that the fortress could fall not because its walls would collapse, but because the will of its defenders would collapse. Therefore, the art of maintaining morale and moral fortitude became no less important than military training or the distribution of supplies. Without faith in victory and strength of spirit, all their supplies, fortifications, and weapons would be completely useless. To combat this invisible enemy, despair, the besieged used a whole arsenal of psychological methods. One of the most powerful shields was religion. In a world where faith permeated every aspect of life, turning to higher powers provided enormous comfort and hope. The castle chapel was transformed from a simple place of worship into a true spiritual center of resistance. Everyone from lords to simple servants gathered here to offer prayers for salvation. The priest or chaplain became a healer of souls, his sermons and words of support instilling courage. Common religious rituals, singing psalms and hymns create a powerful sense of unity and faith that their cause was just and under divine protection. This helped them to remain calm and not panic even in the darkest hours. In addition to religious practices, simple human joys played a huge role in helping to distract from the gloomy thoughts and horrors of war. People used songs, heroic stories, and even games to preserve a piece of normal life. Evenings around the common hearth, a symbol of hope, turned into a kind of improvised theater. Here, storytellers would recount legends of great heroes of the past who defeated enemies that outnumbered them. Old songs were sung, not only sad and melancholic ones, but also battle songs that lifted the spirits, and sometimes even cheerful ones that elicited much-needed laughter. Sometimes, to stretch their bodies and minds, they would organize small competitions or games such as checkers or chess. This was an invaluable time when people could forget their troubles and feel not just besieged, but part of a close-knit community that fought and hoped together. In this psychological war, the leaders, the castle commander, the military commanders, and the Lord himself played a key, decisive role. Their behavior was a mirror for everyone else. By their personal example, they had to demonstrate absolute courage, composure, and unwavering determination. A good leader did not hide in his chambers. Every day he walked around the walls, talked to the soldiers, encouraged them, took an interest in their needs, and shared his meager food with them. He showed that he was not just giving orders, but was part of their brotherhood in arms, that he was not alone in his struggle. His steadfastness and confidence were the beacon that helped everyone else not to lose hope in the darkness of uncertainty. Ultimately, it was their belief in victory, their unyielding will, and their support for one another that helped the besieged withstand the most difficult and seemingly hopeless conditions. They understood that their survival depended not only on the strength of the walls and the number of arrows, but also on the strength of their spirit. It was a psychological battle that they fought within themselves and among themselves as fiercely and resolutely as the physical battle on the walls of their fortress. Passive defense, which consisted of simply sitting behind thick walls and waiting, was a path to defeat. Experienced castle defenders understood this perfectly well. They used various engineering and tactical tricks to actively resist the enemy. In their hands, the castle ceased to be a mere stone barrier and became a living, breathing organism, a deadly predator capable of delivering a devastating counterattack. One of the most sophisticated and technically complex tactics was underground warfare. Besiegers often tried to dig a tunnel, or sap, under the wall or tower of the castle. Their goal was either to sneak inside unnoticed or, more often, to collapse a section of the wall, creating a breach for an assault. This was one of the most terrible threats, and special knowledge was required to combat it. The castle's defenders did not wait for the enemy to dig their way in. They engaged in active countermining activities. Special listening galleries were set up in the basements and cellars of the fortress. Here, in complete silence, experienced listeners placed bowls of water on the floor or scattered peas on stretched leather. The slightest vibration from enemy pickaxes underground caused ripples on the water or movement of the peas, which made it possible to determine the direction and depth of the enemy's undermining with surprising accuracy. As soon as the enemy was detected, work began on creating a countermine, a counter tunnel. It was extremely difficult and dangerous work in cramped, dark, and stuffy conditions. Often, the countermine led directly to the enemy tunnel, and then fierce and desperate battles took place underground, where short swords, daggers, and trench tools were used. But the highest skill was not simply to meet the enemy, but to destroy their siege structures. The defenders could secretly dig a tunnel under the positions where the enemy had set up their most powerful weapons: heavy catapults, siege towers, or battering rams. Upon reaching the desired point, they widened the space, installed wooden supports, covered them with combustible materials, resin, sulfur, dry brush, and set them on fire. The supports burned, and the earth above the tunnel collapsed. A huge siege tower, which took weeks to build, suddenly collapsed into the ground, burying dozens of enemy soldiers under its rubble. This technique was extremely effective, requiring not only physical strength, but also deep knowledge of engineering, and had a tremendous demoralizing effect on the besiegers. The approaches to the castle, the so-called escarp, were never a flat and safe field. The defenders turned it into a veritable labyrinth of death. One of the most common tactics was the use of wolf pits. These were deep, narrow pits that were carefully camouflaged with turf, branches, and leaves. One or more sharpened stakes were placed at the bottom of each pit. During an attack, especially at night, enemy soldiers would fall into these traps, sustaining terrible wounds. It was almost impossible to get out of such a pit, and the cries of wounded comrades sowed panic in the ranks of the attackers. In addition to pits, the so-called garlic, caltrop, was widely used. Metal spikes with 4 points, made so that one spike always pointed upward. They were scattered in tall grass in front of the walls. They easily pierced the leather shoes of the infantry and inflicted serious injuries on the hooves of the enemy cavalry, putting them out of action. Perhaps one of the most famous and spectacular defensive techniques was the use of boiling water, hot resin, or hot sand, which was poured onto the heads of the attackers. For this purpose, special architectural elements called machicolations were provided in the walls and towers. These were hanging loopholes that allowed defenders to attack enemies standing directly at the foot of the wall, in the dead zone. Boiling water was the most accessible weapon. It could not penetrate plate armor, but it seeped into cracks and joints under helmets, causing terrible burns. Red-hot sand was even more insidious, penetrating even the smallest gaps in armor and causing unbearable suffering. But the most terrifying weapon was burning resin or oil. This viscous, sticky liquid did not just burn, it stuck to the body and armor, and it was impossible to extinguish. It was especially effective against wooden assault ladders and siege towers, setting them on fire. The sight of warriors burning alive at the foot of the wall instilled a primal fear in the hearts of the attackers and could often stop even the most furious assault. All these engineering tricks were part of a unified system of active defense. They required incredible ingenuity, composure, and coordinated work. The castle's defenders had to work as a single, flawless mechanism in order to survive and win. They used every means at their disposal, from simple traps to complex underground structures, to protect their home, their family, and their lives. Fire, an element that in peacetime is associated with the warmth of the hearth, comfort, and cooking, shed its friendly mask during a siege and became one of the most formidable and unpredictable weapons. Experienced castle defenders, fully aware of its enormous destructive power, turned it into a subtle tactical tool. It was not just a matter of chaotically setting fire to enemy siege engines, but a well-thought-out and cold-blooded strategy that allowed them to control the battlefield, sow panic, and manage the course of the battle itself. One of the most ingenious ways to use fire was to create thick smoke screens. Long before the siege began, or during lulls in the fighting, defenders could make sorties to place pre-prepared bookmarks outside the walls, in key directions of the enemy's advance. These were not just bundles of brushwood, but specially selected materials: wet straw, damp leaves, green branches, manure, and even rags soaked in water. All of this did not so much burn as smolder, producing a huge amount of thick, acrid, and impenetrable smoke. When the enemy began their assault, an archer on the wall would shoot a single lit arrow into the desired pile. Suddenly, the entire battlefield in front of the attackers was enveloped in a thick, suffocating veil. This veil completely changed the rules of the game. The main striking force of the besiegers, their archers and crossbowmen, became useless. They could not fire accurately at the defenders on the walls, and their arrows went into the milk. At the same time, the defenders of the castle, being on high ground, could often see above the smoke or use brief clearings to fire at the disoriented enemy. The attacking infantry units, finding themselves in the smoke, lost visual contact with each other and with their commanders. Their battle formation fell apart. The attack lost coordination and faltered. Instead of an organized assault, there was a panicked, disorderly crowd, vulnerable and confused. In addition, smoke was extremely effective against cumbersome siege structures. Imagine a huge multi-story siege tower slowly creeping up to a wall, Suddenly, it is enveloped in a cloud of acrid smoke. It penetrates through cracks and loopholes, filling the confined space. It becomes unbearable to be inside. The smoke stings the eyes, makes it difficult to breathe, and causes coughing fits. The soldiers on the upper tiers find themselves trapped. They are forced to leave the tower in panic, becoming perfect targets for the defenders. The same thing happened with the battering rams. The battering ram crew, working under the protection of a heavy wooden canopy, found themselves in a confined space that quickly filled with suffocating smoke. It was impossible to continue working. This simple but incredibly effective technique allowed the besieged to gain precious time, disrupt the enemy's most carefully prepared plans, and force them to retreat without firing a single shot. The use of a smokescreen was not only tactical, but also a powerful psychological weapon. For soldiers advancing on an assault, the sight of a black, billowing wall of smoke suddenly rising before them was a terrifying sight. It created a feeling of complete chaos, uncertainty, and unpredictability. Arrows could fly out of the smoke at any moment. Screams could be heard from there, but it was impossible to see what was actually happening. This fear of the unknown undermined morale more than the sight of enemy swords. Fire and smoke were a vivid and fierce demonstration of power. They were a symbol of the defenders' unyielding determination, showing that they were ready to use nature itself as a weapon and would not surrender without a desperate fight. It was a declaration that they, the besieged, controlled the battlefield. Thus, fire in the hands of a skilled commander ceased to be just an element. It became an extension of his will, a powerful tool in the defense of the castle. It allowed him to blind, suffocate, and disorient the enemy, control the situation on the battlefield, thwart his plans, and gain time, which in the conditions of a prolonged siege was the most valuable resource of all.
Brothers.
In conditions of complete and suffocating isolation, when the massive gates of the castle were tightly locked and reinforced with iron, and enemy patrols turned the surrounding area into a deadly trap, communication with the outside world was cut off. The castle became an island in the raging sea of war, cut off from news, allies, and hope. In this oppressive silence, one of the few, and sometimes the only way to break the blockade, was by pigeon post. This method, known since ancient times, took on a special, vital, almost sacred significance in the critical conditions of a siege. The pigeon ceased to be just a bird and became the last thread connecting the besieged with the living world. In a castle preparing for a long defense, the dovecote was as strategic an object as the arsenal or the granary. These were not ordinary city birds, but elite, carefully selected and trained wing couriers. Their breeding and training was an art form practiced by special people whose skills were valued as highly as gold. Pigeons possessed an amazing instinct to return home, which humans learned to use to their advantage. These birds could deliver encrypted messages to friendly fortresses, the capital, or directly to allied troops coming to the rescue. A tiny scroll was attached to their legs with a thin thread or leather ring. The paper for this was made especially thin, almost transparent, so as not to interfere with the bird's flight. This scrap of parchment could contain a message on which the fate of hundreds of people depended. It could be a desperate plea for help, describing the plight of those under siege. The siege has lasted 40 days. Food supplies are running out. The wall at the North Tower is damaged. Or it could be invaluable intelligence. The enemy is building 2 siege towers. The main camp is set up by the river. Their forces are weakened by disease. Such information could be the key to victory for an army preparing to strike from outside. The flight of each such pigeon was a symbol of faith and an act of defiance. At the moment when the falconer's hand released the bird into the sky from the highest tower of the castle, everyone who saw it froze, watching it with their eyes. That little dot rushing into the distance carried with it all their hopes for salvation. Its flight was a silent prayer, a visible embodiment of the belief that they had not been abandoned, that help would come. But sending a pigeon was an incredibly risky business, a real game with death. The besiegers were well aware of this trick and took countermeasures. Enemy archers closely watched the sky above the castle, and a pigeon flying out from behind the walls became a priority target for them. In addition, the enemy could use their own birds of prey, falcons or hawks trained to intercept pigeons. A real aerial duel could take place in the sky above the battlefield. the outcome of which would determine the fate of the entire fortress? In addition to people and birds of prey, there were other dangers. A pigeon could simply get lost in bad weather or fall prey to an accidental predator. And yet, despite all the risks, the defenders sent their winged messengers again and again, because if they succeeded, the reward was unimaginably great. The successful delivery of a single message could mean the imminent arrival of reinforcements, the lifting of the siege, and the salvation of all lives in the castle. Pigeon Post was not just a means of communication. It was a symbol of resilience, ingenuity, and unshakable faith that even in the most desperate, hopeless circumstances, there is always a chance. This little bird flying over the enemy camp helped people keep the most important thing, hope, and not fall into despair, which was more frightening than any enemy. The siege of a medieval castle was a cruel test where everything was at stake. Cold, hunger, and the constant threat of enemy assault required not only military prowess from the besieged, but also incredible fortitude, ingenuity, and the art of survival. They used all the means at their disposal, from natural phenomena and architectural features to ingenuity and psychological tricks, to resist the enemy and preserve their lives and their fortress. Which of these survival strategies did you find most surprising or unexpected? Share your opinion in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel to learn more fascinating facts about medieval history.